lot of you are here that were part of that time period. We were all part of the Kennedy generation. Basically, John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And a lot of us, what we did was we wound up doing things for the community, all right? And since then, I don't think anybody has ever done a study or a video about Basement Workshop. But along comes Christina Ong, by way of Sacramento, I believe, and the University of Pittsburgh, who has interviewed some of you, and she probably hasn't interviewed all of you, but you will have stories, and this is her master's thesis. I incorrectly had said her as PhD thesis, but I guess it'll probably evolve into a PhD thesis, right? So let me just bring up Christina now, and we'll take it from there.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay, great, thank you. Thanks, Corky, for that kind introduction. I haven't done a public talk before, so normally my talks are a lot more boring because they're for academics, so I'm going to try and make this more lively for everybody. So thank you for coming this evening. I know it's a Friday night and this is probably not your number one choice to do on a Friday night, so I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their schedule to be here. I want to thank the organizers of this event, the church here, Corky Lee and Shirley Ng, who couldn't be here tonight, Reverend Bear Lee, and Deacon Rob G. So thank you to all of them for helping to coordinate this event. Also, if you could silence your cell phones, because let me make sure mine is silented. Okay, great. And I'm also going to time myself because I know people all want to eat dinner at a reasonable hour, so I'm gonna make sure I keep on time. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, as Corky said, my name is Christina Ong, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. I'm originally from California, so I'm very familiar with the West Coast movement, but I was not familiar with the East Coast Asian American movement at all. So my work and interest in Asian American activism, racial identity, and immigration actually brought me to New York to study Basement Workshop, which many of you are familiar with because you were involved in Basement, or you have family members or friends who are involved in Basement. And if you don't know about Basement Workshop yet, you will after tonight, I hope. So my master's thesis, as Corky mentioned, is a study of Basement Workshop. However, it's an in-depth analysis of the early years of Basement, so from 1969 to 1973. And as he mentioned, I interviewed a lot of the people in this room. So if you were active in Basement towards the end of Basement or in the later years, you're not necessarily included in this study, but my dissertation will look at the whole of the organization, so you will be included in future research. So as I said, this is an ongoing project, so if people have questions or discussion points towards the end of the Q&A, it's all going to be very helpful for me. So before I get started on my actual presentation tonight, I think it's important for me, especially as a child of immigrants, to acknowledge the space that we're in. Oh, my friend is helping me do that, so hopefully it works. To acknowledge the space that we're in, so thank you to the Chinatown community for welcoming me here. I'm not from New York, and I'm not from any Chinatown at all, so I feel very fortunate to have been able to be part of the community last year and continuing into my research. The neighborhoods, as we've learned, are constantly changing due to gentrification, and Chinatowns around the globe are facing these issues, so it really brings me hope that Chinatown here is committed to engaging with each other and helping support our community. So this is a very crude map of Chinatown from the 60s and 70s outlined. The stars indicate how Basement moved throughout the years, and so the parts that I'm talking about are specifically the first star, number 1, on 54 Elizabeth Street. I want to acknowledge that this land was not originally ours, and it never was. So we are actually standing on Lenape native lands. And if you're ever interested in knowing where, who was owning the lands before U.S. settlers came here, you can go to this website, nativeland.ca, and they're pretty good about explaining what parts of North America belong to which indigenous tribes. Thank you. Okay, so Pittsburgh, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the area, is a starkly black-white city. Racial and cultural diversity is essentially non-existent compared to my hometown in California, where I was consistently surrounded by people of various ethnic and cultural groups. And this is important to me because my training as a sociologist requires me to be reflexive about my identity as a woman, as an Asian American, and as a child of immigrants. And so this always impacts the work that I do. And being in Pittsburgh, isolated from other Asian Americans, really made me more curious about how the role of Asian Americans in a landscape of limited cultural diversity can impact the communities around them. So being reflexive about my identity and the way that the world interacts with me is really what brought me to my research on Basement Workshop and Asian American activism more broadly. So in the beginning of my doctoral program, 2.5 years ago, I was really excited to study the ways that Asian Americans and women of color more broadly were engaging in activism to support one another through acts of solidarity. And I thought about what was happening in Black Lives Matter and Asians for Black Lives, and how Asian Americans were both perpetrating negative racial stereotypes, but also supporting each other and advocating against police brutality against people of color. So studying these things really required me to take a step back, and I didn't really know if the demonstrations in 2015 and into the current day were something that had been happening in the past, before 2015 or even before 1992 when I was born, so you can do the math about how old I am. So Asian American activism wasn't something that I thought had any historical weight or was something that I knew I could study in any real way that gave me any serious academic clout, but it was and it is. So 2 years ago, I decided to read up on Asian American movement literature to give me a wider context. And I looked into things like the Third World Liberation Front and the fight for ethnic studies in universities across the West Coast, particularly in UC Berkeley and in San Francisco State University. And I was really convinced that students on the West Coast were the ones who were leading the way in racial justice movements, but I didn't actually know if this was true. It turned out that racial and ethnic minorities from all age groups across the US were organizing, but they were not only organizing, they were collaborating and working together despite hundreds of miles of distance, without the use of social media or the convenience of the internet. And in uncovering such a history, I stumbled quite serendipitously on the name of an organization called Basement Workshop. At this time, it really felt to me that Asian American organizing was gaining ground in the media and was becoming increasingly vocal about their political opinions, but I had no real way to reconcile the fact that it felt like we were making strides in our political environment, but we were also facing setbacks in the exploitation of Asian immigrant laborers and the perpetuation of negative stereotypes more broadly about Asians and Asian Americans. So in juggling these concerns for future Asian American activism with wanting a deeper understanding of Asian American history, Basement Workshop really just fell into my lap. And so some of the questions that guided me in understanding Basement Workshop or wanting to understand Basement Workshop were the questions that are listed on the slide here. So the first question was, how did people move from an ethnic-based identity to a pan-ethnic one, so identifying as Chinese or Japanese or Filipinx versus Asian American? And then was becoming Asian American a form of assimilationism, so becoming more close to whiteness, or a form of anti-racism and anti-imperialism? And then lastly, how does one's activism impact their understanding of racial identity and vice versa? So in answering these questions, I took a deep dive into Basement Workshop. So essentially, I wanted to know what Basement Workshop, its members, and the kinds of activism they engaged in could tell us about Asian American identity, and what I argue is an identity that's essentially steeped in radical liberal ideology. From the outset, I believe strongly that Asian American identity was rooted in anti-racism and anti-imperialism and anti-sexism. And I believe this was to be true because it was influenced by the Black Power movement, the Chicanx movement, anti-war activism, and feminist movements of the 60s and 70s. So I argue that because of the inspirations of the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement, combined with a broader understanding of racism and discrimination in their own histories, Basement Workshop members' histories, or Basement Workshop's Asian American identity that was taken up was a form of resistance to the dominant social order. The development of Asian American identity allowed members to connect their experiences as gendered beings, as children of immigrants, and as racialized minorities in the US to their activism. So I also want to be very explicit about how I conducted my research, just because I feel like social science research in general is very shrouded in mystery and no one really knows what we do ever, which is fine. And that's kind of our discipline's fault, not anyone else's. So I can get into specific details in the Q&A if people are interested, but I focus my research here explicitly on the years 1969 to 1973, before Basement Workshops moved to a new location on 22 Catherine Street, also in Chinatown. And though the organization was formally active from 1970 to 1986, I take a close look at these early years because I wanted to understand how Asian American identity first emerged and developed and then shifted the organization's focus throughout the years. So I interviewed 29 former members of Basement Workshop over the course of summer and fall 2018, and many of the members, as I mentioned, are in this room. Later I'll ask them to stand up so you can all identify who they are. And many of these people are people who I very much consider my elders as an Asian American myself, but also as somebody who's very interested in activism and understanding how activism today can learn from activists in the past. And so without their contributions and honesty in the interview process, none of these results would be possible. I also worked through upwards of 1,500 archival documents, including 29 issues of Bridge Magazine, Yellow Pearl Arts Anthology, meeting minutes, private correspondences, photographs, and illustrations. So I wanted to thank some people who are in this room and some people who are not, in particular Bob Lee from the Asian American Arts Center and Eleanor Young, who couldn't be here tonight, for providing me with archival documents, and who Eleanor spent a lot of her time organizing her brother Danny Young's documents and organizing them so that researchers like myself could benefit. Thank you to Jeannie Chang, who also couldn't be here tonight, for providing me with copies of her sister Faye Chang's poetry books and other documents. I have a lot more thank you, so I'm gonna try and speed it up because I don't want to spend the whole hour doing that. So very quickly, thanks to Merle and Alan Okada for compiling letters and flyers from their basement days. Thanks to Henry Cheng and Charlie Chin for copies of posters. To Pat and Henry for giving me a tour of Chinatown when I first got here and showing me where all the basement locations were. To Corky Lee for coordinating this talk and always sending me photographs and keeping me updated on everything Chinatown related. To Nobuko for a copy of the Grain of Sand album. To Arlen Huang, who let me rummage through his archives in his studio. And then thank you to all the people who I interviewed for their time, their energy, and their hope in my generation. And I don't think I've forgotten anyone, but if I have, then I'm going to have a full page of acknowledgements in my dissertation. So, although this is very much a historical project, as a sociologist, I draw broad conclusions about racial identity, about immigration and transnational feminism, and politics and social movements through my interviews and through my work in the archives. Some of these conclusions were very surprising to me, and some were expected, so we'll discuss extensive findings toward the end, and then I'll talk about my future plans for my research. As I said, it's an ongoing project. So without further ado, let's travel back to the late 1960s. So in roughly 1968, activists of Asian descent and from around the US were in deep discussions with one another about coining a unifying pan-ethnic identity label that could encompass experiences of Asians across the US. They were inspired by Black Power movement activists who used the term Black as a unifying identifier in juxtaposition to the N-word, and young Asians were dissatisfied with monikers that existed already, like Oriental, that placed them into exotifying categories of difference. As one of my interviewees noted to me, the term Oriental was used for rugs, and also people who are considered Oriental are only considered from the East in the eyes of people from the West. So in this time, labels like Amerasian were used, but the term Asian American really took hold. Yuji Ichioka and his colleagues at UC Berkeley's Asian American Political Alliance are commonly credited with coining this term, although many groups throughout the movement were utilizing this term and discussing which terms to use. University students organized on the West Coast of the US to demand the institutionalization of ethnic studies programs alongside Chicanx and Black students. So, aligning themselves in third world solidarity, the activism centralized in California seemed to move at lightning speed. Similarly to other identity-based groups of the time, Asian Americans did not mobilize in isolation. The Asian American movement was inspired by the surge of social movements that rocked the US from the 1960s. The Black Power movement and anti-war activism in particular are what I argue helped unleash what Asian American poet and activist Faye Chang described as a visceral sense of not belonging to a country that many were born and raised in. Such a sense of ostracization and otherness resulted in Asian Americans wanting to either forge a place within the existing racial regime or a complete dismantling of it. In Karen Ishizuka's study of Asian Americans in the long 60s, she asserts that the goal of the movement was not necessarily assimilation or of representation like in the civil rights movement, but it was actually of liberation and of freedom from oppression, which was a goal much more in alignment with the Puerto Rican Young Lords and the Black Panthers. As an Asian American myself, I wanted to understand just how Asian American identity came to become this radical political identity and a mechanism for anti-racism and anti-imperialism. And it was in this particular time in our country's history that Basement Workshop emerged. Essentially, before Basement Workshop was Basement Workshop, it was called the Chinatown Research Group, which later became the Chinese Professionals Workshop. A small group of 9 predominantly Hong Kong international students from Columbia University's Urban Center and also other professionals in the area were organizing services for the immigrant community in Manhattan's Chinatown. The students, led by Danny Young and his sister Eleanor, completed the first ever Chinatown study in 1969 to understand the needs of the Chinatown residents. Danny said he specifically wanted to remedy the absence of quantitative data on Chinatown residents and community organizations. And this is an example of a question that was in some of the surveys that Chinatown volunteers surveyed for Chinatown residents. During this time, the group working on this project used strictly ethnic identity affiliation and labels to Chinese ancestry. Those who worked on the study continued gathering, and by October 1969, they held a formal meeting where they finalized organizational goals. So as you can see, this is a snippet of the meeting minutes, and you can see what their goals and their missions sort of are. So this group, the Chinese Professionals Group, prioritized unity in action and providing resources to serve our community. So I wondered, why did they decide to organize around specifically Chinese ethnicity? So I argue that these were predominantly Chinese graduate students who were organizing research on Chinatown's residents, and because of their training, they wanted to learn to serve their own community, which were Chinatown residents. And they felt an affinity to Chinese immigrants living in poverty in Chinatown, despite many of these people having elements of economic and educational privilege. This is because Chinese international students faced discrimination in white America, but connected their ideas of unity to purely ethnic-based affiliations and not broader pan-ethnic ones at this time. So then I asked, how does the Chinese Professionals Workshop go from this Chinese-centric, ethnic-focused organization to Basement Workshop, which is a pan-ethnic group with a completely different name and mission? Moving into 1970 to 1971, Danny Young decides to rent out a dank, tiny basement on 54 Elizabeth Street in the spring of 1970. The geographic location of Basement Workshop remains important for this organization, but also for how members' identity continues to develop. So as I mentioned, doing work for the community necessitated a focus on Chinatown residents because that's where the organization was located in. Most members, including those who did not identify as ethnically Chinese, wanted to do their part to assist the Chinatown community, which faced issues of poverty, unfair labor practices, language barriers, and other social problems. These ideas had roots in community-based research, potentially stemming from Danny's education through the Columbia Urban Center, but also because this was reflected in advocacy from other social movements, such as the Black Power movement, doing work to improve Black communities. So at this time, despite moving to 54 Elizabeth Street, the Asian American identity label is still not largely claimed by the organization, but the incorporation of American-born Chinese members, such as Corky Lee, who's standing over there, attending local, and other American-born Chinese who are attending local New York universities expands the priorities of this organization. So a major project of the newly formed Chinatown Community Census Committee, which was not necessarily Basement Workshop, but many members were engaged in this project, was this Chinatown Community Census Committee. And so in the 1970s, the US Census was fast approaching, and it was the first time that the census would be conducted all in English and through mail-in versus door-to-door, door-to-door census taking. And this was a huge problem because Chinatown residents predominantly didn't speak English or read English, and also because many families lived together in multiple tenements, and so if you sent only one letter to one family, it wouldn't count all the families living in one address, if that makes sense. So members of the Chinatown Professionals Workshop and other community organizations organized a Chinatown Community Census Committee that was planning on educating residents on the importance of the census to provide social services for them, and they also provided translation services and a guidance on how to fill out the census form. And I think this is very interesting to me because it reflects what's going to happen with the 2020 census in a lot of Latinx communities. So I definitely see some things still echoing from the 1970s. So in addition to the Chinatown Census Committee, Basement Workshop members were putting together a plan for a 10-day Chinatown Health Fair, whose photo you can see right there, actually, that Corky took. And this really catalyzed Basement Workshop into becoming a larger organization because the event required a lot more members and support than they may have needed before through other previous programs. So the group closed off the west side of Mott Street in order to provide residents with testing for DB, cancer screenings, and vaccinations, among other medical procedures. volunteers from Asian student organizations around New York on college campuses were recruited. People like Feiichi Matsuda, Bob Lee, and many others who became invested in Basement Workshop all contributed to the fair. They built booths from scratch, they organized medical staff, and they advertised to residents and also translated services. This event attracted many Chinese American and Japanese American students into the fold of Basement Workshop. So meanwhile, as the Chinese Professionals Workshop was organizing Chinese social services programs, Japanese Americans were also organizing their own and opening up a new political consciousness. Much like the Chinese members of Basement Workshop, Japanese Americans wanted to organize to progress their own community. However, the small number of Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent on the East Coast made it difficult to implement big changes. Young Japanese Americans were still organizing together by gathering regularly with their elders who were already in activist spaces and by traveling to Japanese activist group meetings around the country. At this time, Nobuko Miyamoto and Chris Ijima, two young Japanese Americans, met while attending the Japanese American Citizens League conference in Chicago of 1970. There, the two of them wrote their first song together celebrating Asian American activism, and they were inspired by meetings with Puerto Rican Young Lords, Native American activists, and the Black Panthers. Before this time, there were no other musicians, especially no other folk musicians, who identified as Asian Americans who were touring the country to sing about problems that they identified as Asian American issues, including the role of anti-Asian racism in the Vietnam War. Soon, they were joined by Chinese American activist Charlie Chin, who was also living in New York City at the time. And the three became known as a grain of sand, and they began performing in cafes, organizations, and storefronts across New York City. After months of discussion, by November 1970, the Chinese Professionals Workshop formally changes its name to Basement Workshop and obtains their nonprofit status through Eleanor Young filing paperwork with the government, signaling, at least in name, a change in priorities from a Chinese-centered organization to a pan-ethnic Asian organization. So in 1970 to September 1972, activities were still centralized in Chinatown, but members of Basement Workshop would slowly spend more time outside of the Chinatown community and interact with other activists from around the city. When members were not working in Chinatown, they would attend activist social gatherings in reclaimed storefronts and in the homes of fellow activists of color. These gatherings were meant to cultivate third world solidarity as they regularly discussed Puerto Rican and Black issues in relation to Asian discrimination. These interactions caused members to develop grander ideas about what they could do to mobilize and alleviate the exploitation of people in Chinatown and beyond. And these ideas, of course, required recruiting a larger membership base, which resulted in the incorporation of activists of Japanese descent who had already been radicalized through participation in other social movements of the 1960s. Newer Japanese American members of Basement Workshop introduced their Chinese American friends to women like Min Masuda and Kazuo Ijima, who helped solidify their beliefs in community support for and by Asian Americans, while others like Yuri Kochiyama taught them about cross-racial solidarity. Inspired by such political activism, new members of Basement Workshop wanted to build something from the sentiments of their elders, and this brought about their major project, Yellow Pearl, an arts anthology intended to highlight the unpublished songs of A Grain of Sand, who had also become involved in Basement Workshop. So the group writing, illustrating, and coordinating the production of Yellow Pearl were all young Asian Americans, students, or young professionals. The works exhibited in Yellow Pearl spanned a variety of topics that mainstream art and music failed to comprehend, and it was 57 pages of prose, poetry, illustrations, and photographs that covered topics from US imperialism in Vietnam and Laos to the day-to-day lives of people in Chinatown who lived in poverty. The pan-ethnic identity of Asian American articulated a feeling of racialized otherness in the US while enacting a sense of transnational consciousness of Asian Americans' shared political struggles with those on the Asian continent. Ultimately, the lack of attention to such intersectional issues raised within the US involvement in Vietnam prompted Asian Americans like those in Basement Workshop to organize separately from their white anti-war counterparts. This is critical because it highlights the agency of Asian Americans in organizing against imperialism and racist regimes that were overlooked by even progressive anti-war advocates in white America. This poem, written by Chris Ijima, extends empathy and worry to children caught in the midst of the US's wars in Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia. Although the poem doesn't explicitly name these countries directly, the political and social environment of the time allowed for a general understanding between Asian Americans that this is what's being referred to. Members' own experiences in the war influenced their work in Yellow Pearl. Larry Hama illustrated this work that accompanied a poem in this anthology. Hama, who was known for creating the G.I. Joe comic book illustrations, among other infamous comics, illustrated many pieces in Yellow Pearl. He worked demolition in the Vietnam War when he was drafted into the army prior to becoming involved in Basement. And during our interview, he said it was too difficult or that he didn't want to talk about his involvement in the war, but that his art allowed him to process alongside other Asian Americans who had not been drafted what he experienced. Even while focusing on Chinatown, members articulate a connectedness that Fei Chang writes about here in her poem, which I excerpted on the side. She talks explicitly of adventures of Yellow Peril and calls out little Tokyos and Chinatowns, and she is speaking to her target audience, which is her Asian American brothers and sisters, about how they feel change is coming. Much like other pan-ethnic and race-based social movements of the time, Asian Americans faced issues stemming from gender discrimination within their own community. Women in Basement Workshop attempted to bring these issues to light through poetry and illustrations, representing their struggle as hypersexualized Asian women. An increase in government funding soon required members to propose and implement projects that would have wider acceptance, which meant that the members had to grapple with an organizational question: is Basement Workshop an arts organization or is it a political organization? And existing projects like Bridge Magazine became more political in nature, though they still had pages dedicated to Asian American poetry, books, and movie reviews. Most notably, the editorial board decided to survey political leaders on issues important to Asian Americans. So with Yellow Pearl, Basement Workshop could no longer describe themselves as a purely Chinese group serving the needs of Chinatown. However, some groups within Basement Workshop still clung to ethnic identity, which caused some disconnection between their projects. So before Basement Workshop's Pan-Asian magazine Bridge became Pan-Asian, it had a stark Chinese focus. The first issue, which is on the white visual aid, was in August of 1971 and had an editorial board comprised of only Chinese ethnic individuals, including Danny and Eleanor Young. But by issue 4, three non-Chinese members were listed on the editorial team, but the magazine still called Basement Workshop an organization comprised of Chinese professionals and students in their mission statement on the following page. In issue 4, April 1972, there came for a push for more Pan-Asian focus from readers who would write letters to the Bridge magazine staff, resulting Bridge to adopt a new slogan: the Magazine of Asians in America. The magazine's following issue doesn't include the Chinese character for Bridge, which you can see on both covers here, and the articles discuss Asian American studies in New York universities and Japan's influence on the US. And it also included advertisements for purchasing Yellow Pearl. So overall, projects and programs by Basement Workshop highlight the nuances of Asian American pan-ethnicity and ethnic solidarity between formerly disparate Asian ethnic groups. Moving into September 1972, towards the later years of Basement Workshop, Basement Workshop's programs expanded as they obtained grant funding from New York Arts Council, and the organization required a larger space for their activism. Bridge, for example, established a Hong Kong bureau and intended to develop a sister publication called Bridge, the Magazine of Southeast Asians. Basement Workshop's impending growth, both in terms of physical space and in ideology, further complicated the nature of Asian American organizational identity. This increase in government funding required members to propose and implement projects that would have wider acceptance and could not be as radical in nature, which meant that members had to grapple with this organizational question that I posed earlier: is Basement Workshop an arts organization or a political organization? Bridge became more political in nature, though they still had pages dedicated to Asian American poetry, books, and movie reviews. Most notably, the editorial board surveyed political leaders on issues important to Asian Americans. And this is the front page of one of their articles, where they surveyed presidential candidates on issues important to them. So this is an excerpt of the questionnaire. It might be hard to read, but this was compiled by Bridge editorial team to send to presidential candidates and in hope that they would respond to these questions. So these questions highlight what key issues were to Basement Workshop members, including US immigration policies and the discrimination of ethnic minorities, not just Asian Americans, but all ethnic minorities. The responses to this are published in the next issue, and you can see which candidates responded or acknowledged and said, like, yes, we got your letter, but we're not going to say anything. And then there was also no response. And so the following pages of the magazine actually include the full excerpts, and just like, spoiler alert, Shirley Chisholm gave very, very good in-depth answers, and almost no one else did. So, yeah. So If you're interested, I have the full thing, and I can show you all the responses if you like. So throughout this time, the question of what kind of organization Basement Workshop would become is important for understanding Basement Workshop's approach to Asian American organizing. Some members' beliefs in Maoism and communism more broadly towards them away from Basement Workshop as not being radical enough. Questions like who is the art for and what does this actually provide the community and who is the community were frequently discussed. At the same time, members who stayed involved believed in the political power of art in building Asian American consciousness through community arts programs like the ones exhibited in this photo. The Basement Workshop's progression from a Chinese-centered organization to one encompassing projects benefiting non-Chinese Asian ethnic groups heavily influenced members' construction of Asian American identity. So these are some of my master's thesis conclusionary findings, that Asian American identity was developed as a political tool and a form of resistance to a starkly imperialist and white supremacist society. That Asian American identity is not monolithic and carries contentions and disagreements within the group as in any other ethnic identity or racial identity group. And these issues don't necessarily stem from ethnic conflicts such as Chinese and Japanese ethnic minority groups not getting along, but because there were differences in how people believed that liberation would come for Asian Americans. Although Asian Americans strongly identified with other racial minorities and learned from them, this type of organizing by members of Basement Workshop echoes what sociologist Benita Roth calls the concept of organizing one's own, which is when a member of a community group or a member of an identity group collaborates and works with others in that identity group to facilitate action that will benefit their identity group. So the years from approximately 1973 to 1986, before the organizations moved to bigger spaces on 22 Catherine Street and 199 Lafayette Street, was fraught with tension stemming from disagreements in Asian American politics and gender dynamics within Basement Workshop. So analyzing this history of Basement Workshop will increasingly shed more light on how shifting Asian American identity altered the organization's aims. Moreover, the full history of Basement Workshop will highlight how Asian American identity is fluid and constantly changing. Members who took up the Asian American identity floated between using their ethnic identity and racialized pan-ethnic identity, depending on what Basement Workshop's political needs and goals were. Ultimately, how the organization progressively provided members with a sense of community or not a sense of community, dealt with racism and sexism in and out of the organization, and redefined organizational goals is the focus of future research. So I started this research with a specific interest in mind in understanding how Asian Americans could organize against injustice in today's political climate. But historical work uncovering how Basement Workshop impacted the Chinatown community and individual members' development of Asian American identity is, in my opinion, critical to uncovering how young Asian Americans like myself today can advocate for a more equitable world and still grasp their own political and racial identities. As in all good research, I'm left with many more questions than answers, as you can probably tell. I have lots of questions about gender and expectations in leadership positions, about the expansion of Asian American identity to encompass more Asian ethnic groups, such as South Asian and Southeast Asians, and the role of diaspora and imperialism in our understanding of identity. And these are major guides for my dissertation research on Basement Workshop moving into this year and hopefully not too long, but a couple years. I don't know. So as we move into a new election cycle and we receive more reports, or at least I'm seeing more reports of hyper-conservative Asians and Chinese immigrants in particular, I wonder if we can still count on Asian American identity to assume a radical anti-racist and anti-imperialist role. Will we be able to continuously push back against white supremacy as we identify as Asian Americans, or do we need a new unifying label? How does the continued immigration of Southeast and South Asians in particular impact Asian American identity? And I don't really have an answer yet. I don't know if anyone in this room has an answer yet, but looking towards the past and understanding Basement Workshop has provided me with a little bit more clarity on how to move forward. So I hope that this talk has uncovered little known history for you all, or if you are new to the history because you were part of it, maybe it's a good walk down memory lane. I will open up the floor for questions or comments now. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Was there a healthcare component to this? I could.
Sorry, can you explain?
Could you stand up and speak?
I can repeat the question. Yeah, you asked if there was a healthcare component?
Right, because I thought, I could be wrong, I could be mistaken, but I thought that as a result of this, I don't know, basement project or some, whatever the movement in the 60s and 70s that took place here, the Chinatown Clinic was formed as a result.
Yeah.
But there was no mention of that in your.
Yeah. So the Chinatown Health Fair that I had mentioned that Corky has a picture of here developed into the health clinic.
But that came as a result of what
Me-
you said, the basement workshop?
Yeah,
or was that a different movement?
members of Basement were involved, but it wasn't a direct Basement project. But many community members who were involved in Basement were also involved in the health clinic.
Okay, all right, good. No, I'm
Yeah.
saying, just so many things.
There were a lot, yeah,
So
and then
many
there's a lot that I
organizations.
actually didn't cover, so
Mhm.
yeah, but that's a good question.
Okay.
I think a real good entry into part of your question is that the health fair is actually an example of how the different organization, groups, and collective came together from Chinatown and from the movement itself to put that together. So it's not an effort of one particular group or collective, but it just shows that when there is a purpose, people do come together. The question should be asked is that in those days, it seems like those were the best of times for people like in our age. Because there was a super culture that governed the students and the young people, and therefore social consciousness was really high. In fact, the question needs to be asked is that how can we infuse that kind of super culture again today? Because we really need that in view of what's going on today in the world.
Yeah, that is a great question that I think we all, maybe not all, but I think a lot of people in my generation are always thinking about that. For me in particular, I think a lot about the use of social media as a form of allowing people from disparate ethnic and political and global identity groups to discuss and talk about social issues and also mobilize, because things like Ferguson and Black Lives Matter have been mobilizing because of social media. But I also think that because I read some research recently that talked about how the hyper awareness of social issues makes our generation very, very doubtful that change is going to happen, because we are always seeing different issues come up and it doesn't seem like anything's happening, even though I know that activists on the ground are always doing work every single day. And so it seems like nothing is happening, but things are constantly happening and people are constantly engaged. I think the issue for me that I see from my research and from talking with activists in California and in Pittsburgh that has a very, very small Asian American organizing population is that I think there's a disconnection between lessons learned from people who've already done the work in the 70s, people like a lot of you sitting in the room, and people of my generation who don't know that this work has already been done. So it feels like we're reinventing the wheel, even though the wheel was already there and you kind of just need to pick it back up again.
I don't want to monopolize the floor.
No, of course.
I think it's important because you were born in 1972, so from 1969 to now is 2 generations removed. I think you just raised a very good point.
Mm-hmm.
How can we bridge the people who have done some of this work before with people who want to do the same kind of work today? We're not any younger. We're going to go away pretty soon. So it needs to happen pretty soon.
Speak for yourself.
Be real.
Okay, I think you're older than me.
I am.
That is also a great question. I think things like oral history or like narrative-based research like this is one method of teaching people of my generation or even younger generation, because my younger cousins who are what, Generation Z, I guess, they're also are not aware of a lot of the Asian American movement history or just people of color movement history more broadly. And I think programs like this or events like this is one way to help sort of make that bridge, but also I think this is a broader conversation about the institutionalization and like consumerism of university education, because a lot of my friends who are ethnic studies majors or were interested in ethnic studies, they're now not necessarily being taught the things that are like our radical history, because university institutions don't like us to know about our history. At Pitt, there's not even ethnic studies programs, so that's why I didn't research anything in Pittsburgh, because there's no support for that. So it's not just like necessarily like I think there's a knowledge gap because institutions are systematically making us not connect with older generations because it's not in our curriculum and they refuse to let it be part of our curriculum, even still.
We should explore some ways that we can make that connection.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we can talk after. Thank you. Yes.
Is it possible for you to bring the people from basement workshop up here
Yeah.
now so we can hear what
Of
they
course,
say?
yes.
We can ask their questions of them.
Yeah, I was gonna. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, if anyone who is involved in music can come up,
I'll let you talk first.
or you can just stand if you'd like to, if you don't want to walk.
Nice to be
But
up here. And we can hear
Before you do that,
from
can
them.
I ask a question? Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. I'm interested in the intersections of the Asian American movements, like in Northern California, LA, New York, and the ties between them to the extent that they existed. Is that an area of interest, and is there something to that's productive?
yeah, thanks for your question. I think. Did you mean in the 60s and 70s and 80s, or do you
Yeah.
mean contemporarily?
I mean, like at the beginning of the movement, in terms of people that went back and forth in terms of the coasts and sort of the ideas and the
Yeah.
generation of the ideas. Like, almost like, is your work like a history of the ideas, like a history of the ideas that form the movement,
Mhm.
or is it focused, and it could be both, but focused on the institutions that sprang up?
Yeah.
Like, I'm interested in the intellectual history.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question because I think that that was something that was really curious to me is like how do people organize without social media? Like I don't know how that would have worked. And in some of my interviews I asked explicitly and Nobuko actually told me that she was able to fly to different places because the airlines used to have a student rate that was very, very inexpensive. So for her, she could go to different places very easily. I'm not sure if that was the same for all of the Basic Workshop members, but for her in particular, she said that's why she was able to go. And when she would travel, she would go to different activist groups and then share what she had learned whenever she would travel.
And if I could just because I went to the 50th anniversary of the Third World Liberation Front movement in Berkeley,
Yes.
and it was really interesting because their narrative, their history is so different from ours in New York. Like they're talking about how San Francisco State, they got a college and we failed. We've only got a department, and they were talking the whole conversation and what came out of it is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we really don't know about any of that here.
Yeah.
And we hardly know about Basement Workshop, sadly enough. I think because we didn't have the University of California, quite honestly.
Yeah.
But, when I look at the activists today, and Karen was talking about the activists today, and you were talking about it, they're so disconnected from that original movement, and I'm sort of age-wise in the middle. That I'm like, wow, this is amazing. Asian American has carried to today that seems totally disconnected from what birthed it. And that very worries me. So I'm glad you're doing this work.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I think a lot of people my age are very disconnected from Asian American movement history in particular, and also we were very focused on Chinese and Japanese organizing explicitly. There's very little discussion about Filipinx organizing or Native organizing. In terms of the Pacific Islander and the AAPI acronym. So I think that is something that we all have to work on. I don't really have an answer just because I think that, as I mentioned, I don't think that our education system is allowing for us to make those bridges. And so I'm increasingly less hopeful, but at the same time more hopeful whenever I do events like this. But in the institution itself, especially for ethnic studies programs or departments, it is very political how that works, and I think that makes it very difficult for people who are interested even in learning about our history to even get engaged because there's just not enough resources. Yeah.